Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we're talking about something that will make your current weather, whatever that is, wherever you are, feel like a tropical vacation. Tonight, we're sailing straight into the Great Blizzard of 1888. The storm that buried the American Northeast under 10 feet of snow snapped telegraph lines like dry spaghetti, froze horses mid-stride, and killed over 400 people in roughly 3 days. It was the kind of weather event that, even in the context of it was the 1800s and everything was already trying to kill, you still managed to be dramatically, historically, personally offensive. So before you burrow any deeper into your blanket situation, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the weather is right now, because somehow it's always dramatic o'clock somewhere. Now pause for a second. Have you ever thought about what it actually felt like when the sky just decided to end you? What would you do if you left for work on a perfectly normal Monday morning and by noon you were trapped in a snowbank up to your armpits with no phone, no GPS, no weather app, and no one coming to help? What if your commute home, a commute you'd made 100 times, became genuinely life-threatening before you reached the end of the block? Would you stay put? Would you push through? Would you be the person who made brilliant decisions under pressure, or the one who thought it can't be that bad and walked directly into a 20-foot snowdrift? Could you survive 3 days in the most brutal blizzard America had ever seen, using nothing but your wits, a fireplace, a tin of crackers, and whoever happened to be stuck with you? And congratulations, you've just woken up in New York City. The date is March 12th, 1888. Yesterday it was 40 degrees and raining. Today something is very, very wrong. It is the evening of March 11th, 1888, and New York City is completely, blissfully, catastrophically unaware of what is coming. The weekend has been mild and damp, the kind of grey, soggy late winter day that makes you feel vaguely annoyed but not particularly threatened. People have gone to church, visited neighbours, caught up on errands. Children have played outside without coats. Shopkeepers have left their awnings down. The weather, by all accounts, is forgettable. And that's exactly the problem. Because somewhere out in the Atlantic, 2 massive storm systems are colliding with the enthusiasm of people who have never been told no. Arctic front pushing down from Canada is about to slam into a warm, moisture-heavy system rolling up from the Gulf of Mexico, and the result is going to be something no weather instrument in America in 1888 has the vocabulary to fully predict. There are no satellites, there are no radar systems. There are no emergency text alerts buzzing on anyone's wrist. There's just a slightly nervous signal from the US Army Signal Corps, the closest thing the era had to a weather bureau, that goes largely unnoticed, largely unheeded, and largely too late. You, if you're a New Yorker on this particular Sunday evening, are probably doing something very ordinary. Maybe you are finishing supper. Maybe you're reading the paper near the lamp, squinting at the print the way people did before anyone had thought to make the bulbs brighter. Maybe you are putting your children to bed and telling them, with the easy confidence of a parent who has no reason to think otherwise, that tomorrow is a school day and yes, they will be going. The city outside your window is doing its usual Sunday evening thing, quieting down, lamps flickering on in windows, a few last stragglers making their way home through streets that are damp but navigable. Nothing about the sky looks like a warning. Nothing about the air feels like a threat. It is just March. Cold, ordinary, unremarkable March. In the saloons, the last of the weekend drinkers are finishing their glasses. In the churches, the last services of the day are letting out. In the newspaper offices, the editors are putting Monday's editions to bed with the weather note tucked somewhere in the middle of the paper, next to the shipping forecasts and the commodity prices, where almost no one will read it. The note says something about rain and slightly cooler temperatures. It does not say anything about what is coming because no one knows what is coming. This is perhaps the strangest and most human part of the whole story. Not the disaster itself, but the ordinary Sunday that preceded it. The completely normal evening. The unwashed dishes left for morning. The boots left by the door, not the heavy ones, because there's no reason to expect anything serious. People making 100 small decisions that assume tomorrow will look more or less like today. Somewhere out over the ocean, the two storm systems are finding each other. The cold air and the warm air and the moisture and the pressure differentials are all arriving at the same coordinates at the same time, which in meteorological terms is the atmospheric equivalent of a very bad idea. But none of that is visible from a Sunday evening in Manhattan. From a Sunday evening in Manhattan, it just looks like a quiet night. You close the curtains, you bank the coal in the stove, you go to bed assuming, as people always assume, that you know roughly what tomorrow will bring. You do not. Tomorrow will bring something that no one in this city has a framework for yet. But for now, it is just Sunday, and Sunday is fine. In 1888, predicting the weather was less of a science and more of a very confident guess made by men with impressive facial hair and limited data. The United States Army Signal Corps, which doubled as the National Weather Service, was staffed by dedicated people doing their absolute best with the tools available to them, which, to be clear, were not great. Observations came in by telegraph from stations across the country, were compiled by hand, and turned into forecasts that were then distributed to newspapers and posted in public places. The system worked reasonably well for slow-moving weather events. The blizzard of 1888 was not a slow-moving weather event. The chief signal officer in Washington had actually reassigned the lead forecaster for the New York region to a different post just months before the storm, leaving the office understaffed at exactly the wrong moment in history. The forecast issued the evening before the blizzard called for fresh to brisk winds and slightly colder temperatures, which is the meteorological equivalent of describing a house fire as warm. The forecast was not issued out of negligence. It was issued out of the genuine limitations of what was knowable in March of 1888, with the instruments and the data available. Weather stations were sparse across the Atlantic seaboard. The observations feeding into the Signal Corps models came from fixed points on land, and the area over the open ocean where the two storm systems were merging was, by definition, a place where no one had instruments. You cannot measure what you cannot reach. And so the forecasters looked at their data, which was incomplete, and made their best assessment, which was wrong, and published it, and people read it, and felt reassured, which was exactly what happened every other time the forecast said slightly colder. The man most directly responsible for the New York forecast that night was a sergeant named Francis Long. He had looked at the incoming data, noted the pressure readings, consulted his maps, and concluded that the incoming system was a run-of-the-mill late winter storm. He was not a careless man. He was not an incompetent man. He was a man working without satellite imagery, without computer modelling, without the 200 years of accumulated weather science that allows modern forecasters to see a storm forming over the ocean days before it makes landfall. He was doing what everyone in his era did, his best, with what he had, in the time available. The forecast was printed in Monday morning's newspapers, alongside the usual notices and schedules and advertisements. Most people who read it filed it somewhere in the back of their minds under probably fine and went about their morning. A few people perhaps noted the word colder and grabbed a slightly heavier coat. Somewhere, perhaps, a farmer looked at the sky with a particular expression that people who spend their lives outdoors develop, a kind of squinting, sceptical assessment, and decided to bring the animals in early just in case. But mostly the forecast did its job, which was to reassure, and the reassurance held until approximately 7 o'clock Monday morning, when the wind came from the northeast at a speed that the forecast had not mentioned, and the snow began to move horizontally rather than vertically, and it became clear within about 20 minutes that whatever this was, it was not slightly colder. The Signal Corps would eventually use the failure of the 1888 forecast as a case study in the limitations of the existing system. Within a few years, the Civilian Weather Bureau was established, taking over from the Army. The tools improved, the data improved, the forecasts improved. Progress, as it usually does, arrived just after the disaster that made it necessary. You wake up on the morning of March 12th, thinking it is a perfectly ordinary Monday, which, as a concept, is already bad enough. There is snow coming down, sure, but snow in March in New York is not exactly shocking. You pull on your coat, your hat, your boots if you own decent ones, and you head out to work because in 1888 you do not get a snow day. There is no one calling ahead to say the office is closed. There is no working from home. There is no checking a weather app that shows you a screaming red warning icon shaped like a snowflake with a skull. You simply go, because that is what people did, and within about 20 minutes of leaving your front door you realize with growing, creeping, stomach-dropping certainty that today is not a normal Monday. The wind hits you from a direction that doesn't make any sense. The snow is not falling so much as it is being flung horizontally directly into your face at what feels like a very personal velocity. Within the hour the drifts are already past your knees, and somewhere behind you the city you just left is already beginning to disappear. The problem for the commuters of March 12th was commitment. By the time most people understood how serious the storm was, they were already outside, already moving, already halfway to somewhere. And halfway to somewhere in a blizzard is a uniquely uncomfortable position to be in, because going back requires the same effort as going forward, and stopping is not really an option, and so most people just kept going. This is, incidentally, the same psychological mechanism that keeps people in terrible meetings, the sunk cost of having already started, except with added frostbite. The elevated rail platforms were packed with people who had made it that far and were not willing to concede the rest of the journey. They stood on open platforms in the wind, because the platforms were open, because no one had built them with this in mind, because the previous winter had been mild, and the winter before that had been mild, and it had seemed, in the general optimism of the 1880s, that perhaps the weather had been tamed along with everything else. The wind on those platforms was something that people later described with the specific vocabulary of physical shock, the kind of cold that doesn't feel like cold at first, that feels like something else, something more aggressive before the numbness settles in. Businesses that were already open when the storm intensified found themselves with staff who had made it in, and customers who had not, or customers who had walked in off the street not because they needed anything in particular, but because the street had stopped being survivable. Shop owners in Lower Manhattan described people simply opening the door and coming in and standing near the back, which in 1888 was not standard retail practice, but which nobody, under the circumstances, found it appropriate to object to. You learn the limits of your social norms, it turns out, at roughly the same rate that the visibility drops. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, the visibility in parts of the city had dropped to 0. Not difficult to see. 0. The snow was so thick and the wind was driving it so hard that there was simply nothing to see but white in every direction at every distance. The city that 5 million people called home had, for all practical purposes, ceased to be visible, and the people who were still out in it were now operating entirely on memory, instinct, and the hope that the next solid thing they ran into would be a building and not a drift. Here is the thing about the great blizzard of 1888 that separates it from merely bad winter weather. It did not gradually get worse. It got catastrophically worse, and it did so at a pace that outran people's ability to respond. By mid-morning on March 12th, winds in New York City were gusting to over 80 miles per hour. Not a steady 80 miles per hour, the kind that gives you fair warning, but a gusting, shrieking, directionally unpredictable 80 miles per hour that would knock a grown man sideways and lift an unguarded hat into the next burrow. The temperature plummeted. Snow that had started as wet and heavy shifted into fine, driving powder that packed into every gap and crevice with the efficiency of something that was genuinely trying to bury the city. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. People who had stepped out for errands 20 minutes earlier could no longer see the building they had just left. The storm had gone from mildly inconvenient winter weather to the atmosphere has declared war on New Jersey in the span of a single morning commute. The speed of the deterioration is what makes the blizzard of 1888 so particularly cruel in retrospect. A slow storm gives people time to adapt. It gives cities time to respond, gives individuals time to make better decisions, gives everyone the gift of gradual. This storm did not do gradual. People who'd looked out their windows at 7 in the morning and seen manageable snow were, by 9, looking at something that had reclassified itself entirely without asking anyone's permission. The temperature drop was as significant as the wind. At dawn on Monday, the temperature in New York City was around 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but not dangerous. By midday it had dropped to below 10 degrees in many parts of the city, and with the wind chill factored in, exposed skin was at risk within minutes. The kind of risk that in normal circumstances would result in people going inside, except that inside, for an enormous number of people, was wherever they were trying to get to and had not yet reached. The wind chill in 1888 was not a concept anyone had formalized into a number. It would not be quantified as a meteorological measurement for decades. But the people standing on the street corners of Manhattan that morning were conducting their own empirical research on the subject, and the findings were not encouraging. The drifts built at a rate that seemed to defy what snow should be able to accomplish in a given amount of time. Streets that had been clear enough to walk at 8 were impassable by 10. Drifts that were knee-high at 9 were waist-high by noon, and still building. The wind constantly rearranging everything it had already deposited into new configurations, new obstacles, new traps. There was no steady accumulation you could track and plan against. There was just, constantly, more. More snow, more wind, more cold, more difficulty, arriving faster than any reasonable person had reason to expect when they left home that morning. The storm peaked somewhere around midday Monday and held its peak through most of Tuesday. That is roughly 36 hours of maximum intensity, which is long enough to change the geography of a city, and that is precisely what it did. By the time Monday afternoon arrived, New York City was being swallowed. The snow was not falling anymore so much as accumulating with a kind of grim, relentless ambition, drifts piling up to 10, 15, 20 feet in places where the wind had funneled between buildings and decided to park the entire contents of the Sky. Streets that had been passable in the morning were now chest-deep canyons of white. Storefronts vanished, railings vanished, the bottoms of lampposts vanished. Entire staircases leading down to basement apartments disappeared under drifts so smooth, and even you wouldn't have known they were there until you stepped off the curb and dropped 4 feet into a hole that had, until recently, been a sidewalk. The elevated railways, which New Yorkers relied on to move around the city, were frozen solid. Trains stalled on their tracks mid-route, some of them suspending their passenger cars 20 feet above the street, with nowhere to go in either direction, their occupants stuck inside for hours in the cold, unable to get down, unable to go anywhere, doing their very best to remain calm about the whole thing. The geography of the city, which New Yorkers had navigated by instinct and habit for years, stopped applying. Streets that you had walked 1,000 times became unrecognizable. The familiar landmarks, the stoops, the fire hydrants, the corner boxes, the vendor carts, had been absorbed into the uniform whiteness. The grid of Manhattan, that great rational achievement of the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, the thing that makes New York so much easier to navigate than most cities its size, became in the blizzard completely irrelevant, because a grid is a concept and a 20-foot snowdrift is a physical fact, and physical facts outrank concepts every single time. The sounds of the city changed too. New York in 1888 was loud. Horse hooves on cobblestones, the grinding of wagon wheels, the calls of vendors, the general productive cacophony of 5 million people in motion. All of that stopped. In its place was wind, just wind, and the hiss of snow moving across snow, and occasionally something structural giving way somewhere in the distance. A roof, a sign, a length of fencing with a crash that was swallowed almost immediately by the weather. People who were inside and safe described the sound of the blizzard as something they had no previous reference for. Not rain, not ordinary wind, not the storms they had known before. Something bigger. Something that had decided to take the city's noise and replace it with its own. In the basement apartments and the ground floor tenements of the Lower East Side, where the poorest residents of the city lived in conditions that were already cramped and cold, the snow piling against the windows and the doors was not a dramatic spectacle. It was a practical problem, immediate and serious. People who needed coal couldn't get to it. People who needed food couldn't get out to find it. The storm that the wealthy were watching through parlour windows was, for the tenement residents, happening in the room with them, in the dropping temperature of the walls, in the draught under the door, in the children pressed together for warmth on a single mattress, in the question of whether what was in the kitchen right now was going to be enough. The city had been buried before in lesser storms, and it had always come back to itself by morning. This time, by Monday evening, there was no sign of morning coming any time soon. Of all the miseries the blizzard of 1888 invented in its 48 hours of existence, one of the strangest and most surreal was the fate of the passengers stuck on the elevated railways. New York's elevated lines were the city's arteries, the main way hundreds of thousands of people moved through Manhattan every single day. On the morning of March 12th, they were packed with commuters heading to work, completely unaware that the storm was about to make those trains the worst place in the city to be. As the snow accumulated and the wind drove drifts up against the wheels and tracks, trains stalled. Engines couldn't push forward. They couldn't safely reverse. The car sat rocking gently in the gale, suspended high above the buried streets, with passengers inside who had nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. Some waited for hours. The temperature inside the cars dropped steadily. People huddled together, shared what food they had, and peered through frosted windows at the city below, which looked less like a city every minute and more like an enormous, extremely cold field. The elevated railways of 1888 were not built for comfort under normal circumstances. The cars were wooden, the heating was minimal, and the windows were the kind that rattled in ordinary breezes, let alone in gusts that were pushing 80 miles per hour. Sitting in one of these cars while it rocked on its track in a full blizzard was an experience that combined the discomforts of a cold room, a moving vehicle, and a very anxiety-inducing height all at once. The passengers were, in the particular way of strangers forced into proximity by circumstance, polite with each other in the brittle, effortful way that people are polite when they are frightened and have nowhere to go. Some trains had been caught between stations, which meant there was no platform to step onto, even if stepping out had been a reasonable option, which in the wind and the cold it was not. Other trains had made it to stations but found the station platforms buried and inaccessible, the staircases down to the street clogged with drifts that made descent impossible. Rescue, when it came, was improvised. Workers climbed up to stalled cars with ladders. Ropes were used to lower passengers down to the street level where others waited below, knee-deep or waist-deep in snow to receive them. Getting a healthy adult man down from a stalled elevated railway car in a blizzard using a ladder and some rope is not a simple operation. Getting an elderly woman down, or a child, or anyone who was already cold enough that their grip was unreliable, was considerably more complicated. Some passengers were stranded for 6 hours, some for longer. The railway companies sent workers along the lines as quickly as they could manage, which was not quickly at all, because the workers also had to get there somehow, and getting there somehow was the central unsolved problem of the entire day. The passengers who eventually made it down to street level found themselves in a city that was, in many ways, harder to navigate on foot than the stalled car had been. They had traded the cold of the train for the wind of the street, and the wind of the street had opinions about that. The elevated railways would not run normally again for days. Some lines took longer. The machinery that the city had come to rely on with the unthinking confidence of people who've never had to think about it, had simply stopped, high above the street, in full view of everyone below who was too busy surviving to look up. One of the first things the blizzard of 1888 did, almost as if it had strategic intentions, was knock out the telegraph lines. In 1888, the telegraph was not just communication, it was infrastructure. It was how businesses transmitted orders and how newspapers got their stories, how governments coordinated, how railroads signalled each other, and how the weather service sent its already too late forecasts to the cities in the storm's path. When the lines came down, snapped by the weight of ice, toppled by the wind, or simply buried under drifts so deep that the poles themselves ceased to exist as far as anyone could tell, they took with them the nervous system of the entire region. New York went dark on the wire. Philadelphia went dark. Boston went dark. Cities that were 50 miles apart suddenly had no way of knowing what was happening to each other. Reports that had been travelling in seconds now had to wait for days. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of an entire civilization discovering, all at once, just how thin the thread connecting it actually was. The sheer number of telegraph lines strung across the skies of late 19th century American cities was, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible. Photographs from the period show utility poles in lower Manhattan carrying dozens of wires each. Some poles supporting upward of 200 lines, stacked and cross-braced and running in every direction, The city skyline at street level was partly obscured by wire. All of that wire was now covered in ice, and the weight of the ice was greater than the poles had been designed to carry, and the poles were coming down and the wires were coming with them, and in some streets they lay across the drifts in tangled heaps that were not merely inconvenient but genuinely dangerous. Live lines in contact with wet snow on streets where people were trying to walk. The silence that followed the loss of the lines was something that people in the communications industry felt immediately and viscerally, in a way that was not true for the general public. For the telegraph operators, the newspaper wire editors, the railroad dispatchers who depended on the lines to know where their trains were, the moment the connection dropped was the moment the world they operated in ceased to function. There was no workaround. There was no backup system. There was just the sudden, disorienting absence of information in a profession where information was everything. For the general public, the silence was slower to register, but no less significant. You went to the newspaper office to find out what was happening in the rest of the country, and the newspaper had nothing to tell you because the newspaper also had no idea. You went to the telegraph office to send a message to your family in Connecticut, to your business partner in Boston, to tell someone somewhere that you were all right, and the telegraph office was dark. The operators looking at dead instruments with the specific helplessness of skilled professionals whose skills have temporarily become irrelevant. The lines would eventually be repaired. New poles would be sunk. New wires strung, the connections restored in the days and weeks after the storm. But the process of repairing them would itself spur a conversation that was already quietly underway. Perhaps, given how vulnerable above-ground lines were to weather, it would be worth considering running them underground instead. The blizzard did not immediately solve this problem, but it made the problem impossible to ignore, and the underground conduit systems that would eventually replace the tangle of overhead wires in New York streets owe their existence, in part, to the ice that brought those wires down in March of 1888. We need to talk about the horses, because the horses had a genuinely terrible time and they deserve acknowledgement. In 1888, horses were not a charming anachronism or a romantic throwback. They were the engine of urban America. They pulled streetcars and delivery wagons, carried police officers and fire brigades, hauled coal and milk and mail and meat. New York City alone had tens of thousands of horses working its streets every day, and when the blizzard of 1888 hit, every single one of them was in serious trouble. Some horses were caught in the open when the storm intensified and simply couldn't be moved. The snow packed around their legs. The wind disoriented them. Horses that had worked city streets their whole lives were suddenly, terrifyingly lost in a whiteout they had no capacity to understand or prepare for. Some were found frozen where they stood. Others were so stuck that the only humane option was to dig them out by hand over the course of the hours, a process that required people to be outside in the very conditions that had trapped the horses in the first place. The relationship between a city the size of New York and its horses in 1888 was one of total, unexamined dependency, the kind of dependency that you only notice when it fails. Every function of the city that required physical movement over any distance required a horse. The fire department's pumpers were horse-drawn. The police department's patrol wagons were horse-drawn. The ambulances were horse-drawn. The streetcars that most working people used to commute were horse-drawn. Remove the horses from the equation, and you have removed, in one move, almost everything the city uses to respond to an emergency. Now remove them in the middle of the worst emergency the city has seen in living memory. That is 1888. The stable operators of the city faced an impossible situation. The horses in their care needed to be fed and watered regardless of what the weather was doing, which meant stable hands were out in the storm doing the basic work of animal husbandry, while the city around them was collapsing. The horses that were already on the streets when the storm peaked were the ones who suffered most. Working animals by nature were kept outside for much of the day, and many of them were still hitched to wagons or streetcars when the conditions became untenable. Drivers made decisions to push on or to stop, to try to get the horse to shelter or to leave the wagon where it was, with the limited information available to them in 0 visibility and 50-mile-per-hour winds. Some of those decisions worked out, some did not. There is something in the record of this storm that keeps returning to the horses, the individual accounts, the newspaper stories filed in the days afterward, the descriptions of animals standing chest-deep in drifts, still hitched to wagons that had not moved in 12 hours, still waiting in the particular patient way that working horses wait. The people who worked with them felt the weight of it. The blizzard killed hundreds of horses across the region, and the cost in both economic and human terms was enormous, not just because horses were expensive, but because without them, every task the city needed to perform in the aftermath of the storm was that much harder to accomplish. You cannot dig out a buried city without horses to move the snow. You cannot haul away the debris without horses to pull the wagons. You need them most precisely when they are least available, which is, historically speaking, exactly how these things tend to work. The Great Blizzard of 1888 killed over 400 people, and it did not kill them evenly or randomly. It killed them in the particular way that disasters always do, selecting for vulnerability, for bad luck, for the moment when a decision that seemed reasonable turned out to be catastrophic. Some died trying to get home. Men who had survived the morning commute and made it to work decided, as the afternoon progressed and the storm showed no sign of stopping, that they would rather be frozen walking home than spend the night on a colleague's office floor, and so they walked, and the drifts took them, and they were found days later, close to home but not close enough. Others were elderly or sick, or alone in homes that couldn't be reached once the streets became impassable. Delivery drivers who stayed on their routes a little too long. Children sent on errands before adults understood how fast things had gotten bad. The blizzard was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It did not swoop down and take people in a single, cinematic moment. It just kept snowing, and people kept making human decisions, ordinary, reasonable, understandable decisions, and sometimes those decisions were the last ones they made. The cold was the primary killer, but it was rarely the only factor. The pattern in the deaths recorded after the blizzard is almost always a combination of exposure and circumstance. A person who was already weakened by illness, or who was too far from shelter when the temperature dropped, or who had made it almost far enough and then ran out of the particular combination of strength and luck required to make it the rest of the way. The storm did not kill people dramatically. It killed them quietly, in the cold, in the dark, in places no one else could get to. The geography of death during the blizzard was revealing. A disproportionate number of those who died were found outdoors and alone. People who'd been separated from others, who had no one to pull them out of a drift or push open a door for them or notice that they had stopped moving. The social infrastructure that normally catches people, the neighbours, the passers-by, the casual network of eyes that a populated city provides, had been suspended by the storm. The streets were empty. The people who might otherwise have seen someone in trouble were inside themselves, waiting it out, unaware that 30 feet away, on the other side of a snowbank they couldn't see through, someone needed help. The deaths in the rural areas surrounding the city followed a different pattern but the same logic. Farmers found frozen in their own yards, close enough to the house that in clear weather they would have been home in 30 seconds. People who'd gone out to check on something, an animal, a fence, a neighbour, and had not come back. The snow covered everything with the same smooth indifference. It did not distinguish between the important and the unimportant, between the person who had somewhere to be and the person who was simply in the wrong place when the temperature dropped below the point that a human body can maintain itself against. The final count, over 400 dead across the region, was arrived at over days and weeks as the snow melted and the full picture assembled itself. Every number in that count was a person who had woken up on Sunday thinking about Monday. While the story of the blizzard of 1888 tends to be told as an urban disaster, a story of New York and its elevated trains and its buried streets, out in the rural northeast and across the plains states, the storm was something else entirely. Farmers had no city infrastructure to fail them, because they had no city infrastructure to begin with. What they had was land, animals that needed constant care, and houses that in many cases were separated from the nearest neighbour by miles of open field that the wind has turned into a horizontal wall of white. Getting from the farmhouse to the barn to feed the livestock was not a given. That distance, which on a clear day took 2 minutes, could in a blizzard become genuinely life-threatening. People tied ropes between buildings so they could follow the line back if visibility dropped, which it did, instantly, completely, and without mercy. Some made it. Some did not. Livestock died in barns when the ventilation failed or the temperature dropped below what even huddled animals could survive. And then the silence came, and the snow kept falling, and the farms sat alone under it, waiting for the world to remember they were there. The farms of the northeastern United States in 1888 were not, it bears noting, particularly well equipped for catastrophe. Farm buildings of the period were functional and often cold, adequate for normal winters, not designed with the blizzard of 1888 in mind, because nothing was designed with the blizzard of 1888 in mind. Barns that had kept animals warm through ordinary March cold snaps were not prepared for temperatures that dropped into the single digits overnight, with wind driving through every gap in the siding. The animals that farmers depended on for their livelihoods, their milk cows, their draft horses, their sheep, needed to be checked on, fed and watered around the clock regardless of what the weather was doing. The work did not pause because the blizzard had arrived. It just became much, much harder and considerably more dangerous. The rope between building system, which sounds almost quaint when described in historical accounts, was not quaint when you were using it. It was a desperate measure employed by people who understood, from the animal logic of someone who works outdoors for a living, that once visibility went to zero, your sense of direction became unreliable in a way that you could not think your way out of. The wind in an open field disoriented people who had lived on the same land for 20 years. The ropes were lifelines in the literal sense, something to hold while everything recognizable about the landscape disappeared. People gripped them the way you grip something in the dark when you cannot see what you might fall into, which is to say, with everything they had. The isolation of the farm in the blizzard was a different quality of isolation from the urban experience. In the city, you were surrounded by people you could not reach. On a farm, you were surrounded by nothing. The nearest help was miles away across drifts that had made the road disappear. There was no one to send for, and no way to send for them anyway. The decisions made on a farm during the blizzard of 1888 were made entirely alone, in the dark, in the wind, with the animals depending on whoever was standing in that barn, and with no way of knowing when anything was going to get better. The farms that came through the blizzard did so not because they had better tools or better luck. They did so because the people on them made the right calls, one after another, in conditions that made every call harder than it had any right to be. One of the more quietly harrowing subplots of the blizzard of 1888 involves the children. Specifically, it involves the question of what you do with a school full of children when a catastrophic storm arrives faster than anyone anticipated, and you have to make a decision right now about whether to dismiss them or keep them. Some schools dismissed early, believing children would be better off at home, only for the storm to intensify so rapidly between dismissal and arrival that children were caught in drifts that rose above their heads within minutes of leaving the building. Some teachers held their classes inside and stayed with them overnight, keeping fires going and improvising meals out of whatever happened to be in the building. Some children made it home with the help of strangers who pulled them from snowbanks or walked them to the nearest shelter. In the stories that survived this blizzard, the children who lived through it remembered it with a particular vividness, the specific quality of cold that is also sound, the way the snow tasted, the feeling of being very small in something very large. The decision of when to dismiss school on the morning of March 12th was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential small decisions made that day, and it was made by individual principals and teachers in individual buildings with no coordinated guidance and no real sense of what was coming. Some of them looked out the window at 8 o'clock and saw snow and decided to carry on as normal, which was a reasonable decision at 8 o'clock. By 10 o'clock it was no longer a reasonable decision, but by 10 o'clock the decision had already been made and the children were already in their seats, and the question had shifted from whether to dismiss to whether to dismiss now or wait a little longer. Waiting a little longer, in the blizzard of 1888, was frequently the wrong answer. The children who were dismissed and sent home alone faced conditions that adult commuters were struggling to navigate. A drift that came to an adult's waist came to a child's chest, or higher. The wind that knocked a grown man sideways simply picked smaller children up and moved them. There are accounts in the newspapers of the days following the storm of children found in drifts within a block of their schools, close enough that in clear weather they would have been home in minutes. There are also accounts of children found safe in the homes of strangers who had opened their doors, of shopkeepers who had pulled small figures in from the street and kept them warm behind their counters until someone came to collect them. New York in a crisis has always been, despite its reputation, a place where strangers help strangers, and the blizzard of 1888 provided considerable evidence for this proposition. The teachers who chose to keep their students inside overnight made a decision that was, logistically speaking, not a simple one. A school building in 1888 was not provisioned for overnight stays. There was coal for the stoves, which the teachers kept burning, and there was water, and whatever food happened to be on the premises, or could be fetched from nearby businesses by adults willing to brave the street for short distances. Children slept on floors and in coat rooms and in chairs pushed together. They were frightened, some of them, and cold, and missing their families, and the teachers who held them together through that night, keeping fires going, telling stories, maintaining the particular calm authority that children need when everything is uncertain, did something that required more courage than it perhaps sounds like from a comfortable distance of over 100 years. The children who remembered it always remembered the teachers. They remembered them by name, specifically, decades later. That is its own kind of testimony. Here is a thing that will not surprise you once you consider the era. One of the primary forms of an emergency shelter during the blizzard of 1888 was the saloon. New York in 1888 had more saloons than it had churches, more than it had schools, and frankly, more than it had most things, because a saloon was not just a place to drink, it was a public room, a community space, a heated interior with a door that opened to the street and, in theory, to anyone who needed to come in out of the cold. During the blizzard, saloons across the city became impromptu emergency shelters. Men and women who couldn't get home, strangers who had given up fighting the drifts, delivery men who'd abandoned their wagons, children separated from parents, all of them ended up in saloons, warming themselves by coal stoves, accepting whatever was being served, and waiting out the storm alongside people they had never met and would probably never see again. It was not the intended function of the institution, but it worked. The saloon in late 19th century New York was a genuinely democratic space in a city that did not have many of those. It was one of the few interior environments where a working man could sit for an extended period without being required to purchase something at regular intervals or justify his presence to anyone. The coal stoves that heated them were kept burning around the clock, and the owners of saloons, whatever their individual motivations, generally understood that a warm room full of people was good for business, in a way that a warm room full of nobody was not. When the blizzard hit and people started coming in off the street in various states of frozen distress, most saloon operators made the practical calculation that this was not the moment to be strict about house rules. The social mixing that happened inside those saloons during the blizzard was the kind that the city's rigid class and ethnic divisions normally prevented. A delivery driver from the Lower East Side sitting next to a clerk from a downtown counting house, both of them wrapped in their coats, both of them waiting out the same storm, both of them accepting a glass of something warm from the same bartender who was doing his best to keep everyone functional. The neighborhoods of 1888 New York were deeply segregated by class, by ethnicity, by religion, by a dozen invisible lines that people observed every day without thinking about them consciously. The blizzard suspended those lines for the duration of the storm, and the saloon was the space where that suspension was most visible. The drinks being served were not, in most cases, the sophisticated cocktails that certain New York establishments of the period were known for. They were hot coffee when the coffee lasted, warm beer, whiskey at room temperature, whatever was available and could be dispensed quickly to a room that kept getting more crowded as the afternoon progressed. The food, where there was food, was whatever the kitchen had. Bread, cold cuts, pickles from the barrel on the counter, the kind of provisions that saloons kept for their regular customers and that were now being distributed with considerably less selectivity than usual. Nobody who came in from the blizzard that day was turned away for being unable to pay. Some saloon keepers kept a tab they knew would never be settled. They did it anyway. You cannot always explain human decency. Sometimes it just shows up in a warm room in the middle of a storm and does what it does. The blizzard lasted roughly 36 to 40 hours at its peak, which is a very long time to improvise. And improvise people did, because in 1888, improvisation was not a lifestyle choice. It was a baseline survival skill that most people exercised on a regular basis and were thus reasonably good at. Strangers shared food with strangers. Landlords who had never opened their doors to anyone let people sleep on floors. People who could not get to work found themselves doing things like digging out their neighbours, hauling coal for elderly residents who couldn't reach their own supply, or fashioning makeshift sleds out of whatever flat wooden surfaces were available. Entrepreneurs, and New Yorkers never had a shortage of these, immediately began charging extortionate rates for the most basic services. Shovel a path, $1, carry a bag, whatever the market would bear in the moment. The blizzard was not just a test of physical endurance, it was a test of character, and people, as they tend to in disasters, performed the full range of everything that word can mean. The improvisation was not always elegant. It was frequently messy, occasionally dangerous, and in some cases involved decisions that looked extremely questionable in retrospect, but were in the moment the best available option. People wrapped their feet in newspaper under their boots, because newspaper is a surprisingly effective insulator, and they had newspaper, and they did not have better options. People burned furniture when the coal ran out, because the choice between a chair and frostbite is not actually a difficult choice once you are cold enough. People ate things they would not have looked at under normal circumstances, because normal circumstances had been suspended and would remain suspended for an indeterminate period, and hunger is a very focused motivator. The improvisations that worked best were the communal ones, the ones where people pooled what they had instead of protecting it individually. A single household with a full coal scuttle and a working stove became, during the blizzard, a resource for everyone within reaching distance, because the people in that household understood that their situation was precarious enough that the goodwill they generated now might be the thing that saved them later. This was not abstract altruism. It was practical mutual aid, the same logic that had governed human survival in harsh conditions since long before any of the people involved had been born, resurfacing in the tenements and boarding houses of 1888 with the unsentimental efficiency of something that actually works. The makeshift sleds deserve a special mention, because they represent a particular kind of New York ingenuity that is difficult not to admire. With horses unable to move and wheeled vehicles useless in the drifts, the only way to transport anything through the buried streets was to slide it. Flat wooden surfaces, doors taken off their hinges, sections of fencing, the lids of shipping crates were pressed into service as sleds, and people moved coal and food and supplies across the city by dragging them through the snow on improvised runners. It was physically exhausting and profoundly inefficient by any rational measure, and it worked well enough to keep people alive who would otherwise not have made it, which is the only measure that matters in a blizzard. The city that could not move on wheels moved on wood instead, and it moved just enough. Within hours of the blizzard of 1888 hitting its peak, the free market had responded with its characteristic enthusiasm. Prices for everything that might conceivably help you survive the next 24 hours went vertical. Coal, which you needed to keep your stove and furnace running, became extraordinarily expensive overnight as supply chains froze and demand spiked. Bread was being sold at premiums that would have been scandalous in normal times, but in a blizzard became merely infuriating. Cab drivers, those few whose horses were still functional, were charging fares that would have been unthinkable the day before, and people paid them, because the alternative was walking, and the alternative to walking was standing still in a 20-foot drift. Newspapers, sensing opportunity with their characteristic timing, would later moralize extensively about the price gouging. The same newspapers, it should be noted, also raised their own prices during the blizzard to account for the difficulty of distribution. Nobody is above the market when the market is actively burying them. The economics of disaster pricing are simple and ancient and consistently infuriating. When supply drops and demand spikes simultaneously, prices rise. In 1888, supply dropped because the railroads and the roads were impassable and nothing was moving into the city. Demand spiked because everyone in the city needed the same things at the same time, warmth, food, transportation, labour, and needed them urgently, which is the condition under which people are least able to negotiate effectively. The result was prices that felt like extortion because in many cases they were extortion, conducted openly in broad daylight by people who had something others needed and were not inclined to be sentimental about it. The shovel market specifically deserves a moment. A shovel in normal circumstances was a commodity item, available at any hardware store priced modestly, the kind of thing you bought once and kept for decades. During the blizzard of 1888, a functional shovel was a scarce and valuable asset. Hardware stores that had them sold out within hours of the storm beginning, and the second-hand market that formed in their wake operated on principles that would have been familiar to anyone who has ever tried to buy a concert ticket from someone standing outside the venue. People who owned shovels and did not need them at the moment were renting them to people who needed them immediately. Prices that would have seemed absurd on Sunday were being paid without negotiation on Monday, because the snow was not going to move itself and time was the one resource the blizzard was not generating more of. The newspapers that covered the price gouging with such moral energy in the days after the storm were not wrong that it was exploitative. They were simply describing with editorial outrage the normal operation of an unregulated market under conditions of extreme scarcity. The lesson that the blizzard offered, and that the editorials were not quite willing to draw explicitly, was that markets work very well for people with money during ordinary times, and very badly for people without money during emergencies. The coal dealer who doubled his prices during the storm was not doing anything illegal. He was doing something that for the families in the tenements who could not afford his new rate and spent the night cold because of it was indistinguishable from cruelty. The blizzard made a lot of things visible that were easier not to see when the weather was cooperative. The railroads were the circulatory system of late 19th century America, and the blizzard of 1888 shut them down completely, which is a bit like a heart attack for the entire economy of the Northeast. Trains were stranded on their tracks from New England down through New Jersey, some of them buried so thoroughly in drifts that they would not be excavated for days. Mail stopped. Freight stopped. The movement of food and goods and coal and everything else that a modern city requires to function ground to a halt with the kind of abruptness that is terrifying in retrospect and was simply bewildering in the moment. Passengers on stalled trains sat in cars that were comfortable for an hour, cold for 2, and genuinely dangerous by the end of a long night. Railroad workers, who under normal circumstances dealt with difficult conditions as a matter of course, found themselves confronting something beyond the scope of normal difficult. Some dug out by hand. Some waited for help that could not get to them. Some made decisions that probably shouldn't have worked, and somehow did. The railroads of 1888 were enormous enterprises, some of the largest corporate structures in the world at the time, and they had procedures for almost everything. They had procedures for delays, for equipment failures, for weather events, for disputes with workers, for disputes with regulators. What they did not have, because it had not seemed necessary to have, was a procedure for the complete and simultaneous immobilization of every line in an entire region under 3 feet of snow with drifts to 20 and winds to 80. The procedures that existed for bad weather assumed that some lines would remain passable, that help could be routed from functioning sections to affected ones. When every section was affected at once, the procedures became irrelevant, and the railroad workers were left to invent responses on the spot. The passengers stranded on the lines outside the city had it worse, in some ways, than the passengers on the elevated railways in Manhattan. At least the elevated passengers were in the city, surrounded by other people and other resources, even if those resources were temporarily inaccessible. The passengers on the commuter and long-distance lines that ran through the countryside north and south of New York were stranded in open landscape, in cars that were rapidly losing heat, with no buildings visible through the windows and no way of knowing how far the nearest town was, or whether it would be any more reachable than the track they were sitting on. Railroad crews made extraordinary efforts under impossible conditions. Workers dug by hand along lines that would have required industrial equipment under normal circumstances. Station agents who could not get relief crews to stalled trains walked the tracks on foot, carrying food and fuel when they could carry it, bringing information when they could not. Some passengers, unwilling to wait for help that was not arriving on any predictable schedule, left the stalled cars and set out on foot across fields they could barely see, guided by whatever landmarks survived the whiteout and by the general principle of moving in the direction that seemed most likely to contain a building. Some of them were right. The railroad companies in the aftermath wrote reports and held inquiries and discussed lessons learned, as large organizations always do after disasters. The central lesson, that the railroad infrastructure of the Northeast had a single catastrophic vulnerability, which was weather, was one they already knew in the abstract. The blizzard of 1888 gave them a very specific and very expensive education in what that vulnerability looked like in practice. Manhattan got the headlines, as Manhattan tends to do, but Brooklyn, which was at this point still its own separate city, not yet consolidated into New York, took the blizzard as hard as anywhere and had less of the infrastructure required to deal with it. Brooklyn's streets were narrower in many neighborhoods, and the drifts that formed in them were correspondingly more extreme. The Brooklyn Bridge, opened only 5 years earlier and still something of a marvel, was passable on foot for much of the storm, which meant that it became, somewhat improbably, one of the more reliable ways to get between the two cities. People walked it through the howling wind and blowing snow, holding onto the cables for balance, their coats packed with ice, because it was still faster than any alternative that presented itself. The neighborhoods of Brooklyn that were not near the bridge made do with what they had, which was each other, and coal if they were lucky, and patience that was tested in the specific way that patience is tested when it is extremely cold and nothing is moving and there is no end time visible. Brooklyn in 1888 was a city of roughly 800,000 people, which made it the third largest city in the United States entirely on its own terms, independent of its neighbor across the river. It had its own government, its own newspapers, its own fire and police departments, and its own set of problems that the blizzard proceeded to make dramatically worse. The Brooklyn Street Railway system, which moved working people across the city's considerable geography every day, stopped operating within hours of the storm's peak, not because anyone decided to stop it, but because the horses could not move the cars, and the cars could not move themselves, and the drifts made the tracks impassable regardless. The working people of Brooklyn who could not afford to simply stay home found themselves stranded at intermediate points between where they were and where they needed to be, which is not a position that resolves itself quickly in a blizzard. The Brooklyn Bridge crossing during the blizzard was not, by any reasonable standard, a pleasant experience. The bridge is over a mile long, and for that entire mile you're exposed to whatever the wind is doing off the East River, which during the blizzard of 1888 was doing a great deal. The cables that people held for balance were covered in ice. The wooden planking of the pedestrian walkway was covered in snow that the wind was constantly redistributing. The towers that rise on either end, which under normal circumstances give the bridge its extraordinary visual drama, were invisible in the whiteout. People who crossed it that day described the experience as walking into nothing. Just the cable under your hand and the wind in your face and the faith that the bridge was still there ahead of you, because you had started on one end of it, and presumably the other end still existed. The outer neighbourhoods of Brooklyn, the ones far from the bridge, the ones where the streets went quiet and the drifts built without the disruption of heavy foot traffic to break them up, experienced the blizzard in a register of isolation that was close to the rural experience. Families settled in for the duration with whatever they had. Neighbours checked on each other when checking was possible. The rhythms of the storm, the periods of most intense wind, the occasional brief lulls that turned out not to be the end, the final genuine easing on Wednesday that people cautiously decided to believe, played out the same way they did everywhere else, just more quietly, with fewer witnesses, in streets that would take longer to dig out because there were fewer hands available to dig them. The Great Blizzard of 1888 produced plenty of dramatic, documented rescues, the kind with names attached, with newspaper stories, with the clean narrative shape that disasters sometimes provide when they want to be remembered well. But for every rescue that got written up, there were dozens that didn't. The working people of the city, the coal deliverers, the bread bakers, the stable hands, the laundresses, the domestic workers, were out in the storm before most people had acknowledged it was won, and they were the ones who kept the basic mechanisms of the city from fully collapsing. They were the ones who figured out the alternate routes when the main roads became impassable. They were the ones who knew which basements were warm, which neighbours were vulnerable, which buildings had the coal to spare, and which were running on nothing. They did not get monuments. They got back to work when the snow melted, because the snow melting did not mean that the rent had stopped being due. The invisibility of working-class heroism in historical accounts of disasters is not a new problem. It is as old as the practice of writing history, which has always had a tendency to follow the named and the documented and the prominent, and to lose track of the people doing the actual work in the background. In the blizzard of 1888, the people doing the actual work were overwhelmingly the people who could not afford to stop doing it. A clerk in a counting house could, with some inconvenience, spend the night in his office. A domestic servant who lived in her employer's house was already where she needed to be. But the day labourer, the delivery man, the laundress who worked by the piece, and was paid only for what she completed, these were people for whom staying home was not an economic option, regardless of what the weather was doing, and who therefore spent the blizzard outside in it, finding ways through. The coal deliverers specifically occupy a particular place in the story of the 1888 blizzard that they have never quite received adequate credit for. Coal was the difference between survival and serious danger for thousands of households across the city, and getting it from the yards where it was stored to the buildings where it was needed required human beings to load it, move it, and carry it through conditions that were actively trying to prevent them from doing so. With horses unable to function and wagons unable to roll, the coal that made it to households during the blizzard was carried by hand, in buckets and sacks, by men who had started their day with a specific route and ended it having improvised their way through an entirely different city at a fraction of their normal speed. They were not celebrated for this. They were paid their usual rate, minus whatever time they lost to the conditions, and they went home when they could get home and came back the next day. The domestic workers, the women who cooked and cleaned and managed the physical operations of the city's households, kept those households running through the storm with a level of skill and adaptability that their employers frequently took entirely for granted. They kept the fires going, managed the provisions, cared for the children, and in some cases provided the only calm and competent presence in houses where the people nominally in charge were considerably more distressed than they were letting on. They did all of this without recognition, and largely without acknowledgement, because that was the arrangement, and disasters do not change arrangements, they only make the arrangements more visible to anyone paying attention. Beyond the horses, and the horses, as we've established, had a very bad time. The blizzard of 1888 was a catastrophe for animals across the region. Livestock in inadequately insulated barns died from cold. Poultry, which requires very little provocation to die under ordinary circumstances, died in significant numbers. Dogs and cats that had been outside when the storm hit were found frozen days later, or simply disappeared into the drifts, which, to be clear, were deep enough to disappear a grown man, let alone a terrier. But some animals surprised people. Cattle that had huddled together in open fields, using each other for warmth in the same way medieval peasants once did with their goats, survived conditions that seemed unsurvivable. Horses that found shelter against stone walls or in stands of trees held on through the night. And in a story that circulated through several newspapers after the storm, a single cow in Connecticut was found alive after being buried in a drift for 3 days, apparently sustained by the warmth of her own breath recycling inside the snow cavity she had created around herself. She was, by all accounts, extremely irritated. The poultry losses were, in economic terms, significant, and in dramatic terms, somewhat absurd. Chickens are not built for adversity. They are built, it sometimes seems, specifically to die in creative and unnecessary ways, and the blizzard of 1888 provided them with an extraordinary range of opportunities to do so. Chickens that had been left in coops that seemed adequately sheltered were found frozen in the morning. Chickens that had somehow escaped from their coops before the storm peaked were found in various locations around farms, having apparently made a series of progressively worse decisions about where to go in zero visibility and 50-mile-per-hour winds. The farmers who lost their flocks lost not just the eggs they would have produced, but the income those eggs represented, and in a region where farm income was already not generous, the losses added up to real hardship. The cattle that survived by huddling did so by applying a principle that is, when you think about it, more sensible than most of the decisions humans made during the same storm. A group of cows pressed together in a field creates a collective thermal mass that is significantly warmer than any individual animal could maintain alone. The outermost animals bear the brunt of the cold, and the innermost animals are genuinely warm. And if the group is large enough and the animals cooperative enough, this system works well enough to survive temperatures that would kill any individual member of it. This is not instinct exactly. It is something more basic than instinct. The simple physics of bodies in contact generating and retaining heat. The cows did not decide to do it. They just did it, because it was what made sense, and it saved them, while the chickens were off making worse choices. The Connecticut cow found alive after 3 days in a drift was, in the newspaper accounts, treated as something between a miracle and a curiosity. Reporters who travelled to document her story found a large, healthy, extremely unimpressed animal who had survived by breathing in a tight space until the warmth of her breath melted the snow around her face enough to keep an air pocket open, and then continuing to breathe in that space for 72 hours until someone finally dug down to her. She had lost some weight. She was cold. She produced milk when she was eventually returned to the barn. She did not appear to regard her survival as remarkable, because she was a cow, and cows do not do retrospective gratitude. But the farmers who heard her story did, because farmers understand better than most people the specific, quiet miracle of an animal making it through a night it had no business surviving. When the snow finally stopped falling and the wind finally relented, sometime in the early hours of Wednesday, March 14th, what was left behind was less a city and more of an enormous, lumpy white landscape with buildings in it. The scale of the digging out required was almost incomprehensible. Not just streets, but sidewalks, stoops, basement entrances, stables, rail lines, telegraph poles, and every other piece of infrastructure that had spent the last 40 hours being systematically buried. The city organised work crews, and private citizens organised themselves alongside them, and everyone with a shovel that had not already been sold at a 400% markup used it. The drifts were so deep in some places that men could not simply shovel them. They had to tunnel through them, which took longer and was colder, and was genuinely strange in the way that doing something underground in the middle of a city is always genuinely strange. The horses that had survived were pressed back into service immediately, because the city needed them, and the city was not particularly sentimental about it. The logistics of digging out a city of 5 million people after a storm of this scale were staggering even to think about, and the people who had to actually do the thinking while also doing the digging found the reality somewhat worse than the theory. Snow in the quantities deposited by the blizzard of 1888 had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was not obvious. You could not simply shovel the streets clear to where. The sidewalks were buried, the vacant lots were buried, the parks were buried under drifts so deep that depositing additional snow on them required hauling it there first, which required passable roads, which required the snow to already be moved. The logical circularity of the clean-up operation was one of those problems that could not be solved elegantly, and had to be solved by brute force, by moving snow from the places where it was most problematic to the places where it was merely inconvenient, one shovelful at a time. The workforce assembled for the digging out was enormous and largely informal. The city hired labour where it could, paying daily rates that were, relative to normal wages, reasonable, and which attracted men from every neighbourhood who needed the income and were physically capable of the work. Alongside the hired crews worked volunteers, or people who were not exactly volunteering, but who understood that their street was not going to be cleared unless they cleared it, and who therefore picked up whatever was available and got started. The ethnic neighbourhoods of Lower Manhattan, the Italian blocks, the Jewish blocks, the Irish blocks, the German blocks, each organised their own clean-up with the internal social cohesion that those communities maintained and that, in emergencies, turned into genuine operational efficiency. The railway companies sent their own crews out along the lines with specialised equipment, ploughs, where the ploughs could be gotten to, and hand shovels everywhere else. The elevated railways, which had the additional problem of being 20 feet in the air, required workers to climb up to the tracks and clear them manually, which was cold work even after the wind had stopped, and which produced the additional hazard of the cleared snow falling directly onto the buried streets below, which were frequently still occupied by people doing their own digging. By Thursday, the main arteries of the city were passable. By the end of the week, most of the secondary streets had been addressed. The alleys and the side streets and the quiet back passages of the city's outer neighbourhoods took longer. Some of the deeper drifts in sheltered spots where the sun could not reach them lasted into April. They were a lingering reminder in the early spring of 1888 of what March had decided to do. New York City in the days after the blizzard of 1888 had the particular energy of a place that has been through something and knows it. The nervous, buzzing, slightly traumatized energy of survivors who are simultaneously relieved, horrified, and already looking for someone to blame. The economic damage was significant. Businesses that had been closed for 2 to 3 days during one of the busiest commercial weeks of the year tallied their losses with a particular grimness. Railroads assessed the cost of excavating their lines and repairing their equipment. The telegraph companies began the enormous task of restringing hundreds of miles of wire. Insurance companies received more claims in 1 week than they typically processed in a month. And the city's newspapers, which had been operating under genuinely difficult conditions throughout the storm, managed to publish continuously, sometimes in reduced form, sometimes with pages that were partly blank because the typographers couldn't get in, but continuously, which they were rightfully proud of and would mention, with increasing elaboration, for the next 30 years. The financial reckoning of the blizzard played out over weeks and months in the ledgers of every business in the affected region, and the numbers were not cheerful reading. The estimated total economic loss from the storm across the northeastern United States ran into the tens of millions of dollars, a figure that in 1888 represented a genuinely staggering sum, arrived at by adding up the lost commercial activity, the damaged infrastructure, the dead livestock, the ruined inventory, the wages paid to clean up crews, and the replacement cost of everything the storm had broken. No single number captured it cleanly, because the losses were distributed across too many individual businesses and households and farms to aggregate neatly. What the numbers did capture collectively was the basic economic logic of a major disaster, that the cost of rebuilding is always larger than it appears until you start adding things up. The businesses that recovered fastest were the ones that had been most flexible during the storm itself, the ones that had found ways to operate, even in reduced form, even under impossible conditions, and had therefore maintained their relationships with customers and suppliers through the disruption. The businesses that recovered slowest were the ones that had shut completely, whose customers had found other arrangements during the blizzard and had not automatically returned when the streets cleared. In 1888, as in any era, the economic aftermath of a disaster sorted itself according to who had the resources to absorb the loss and who did not. The large railroad companies could afford to spend what the cleanup cost. The small shopkeepers who had lost 3 days of revenue in a week when the rent was due could not always say the same. The insurance industry's response to the blizzard claims was, by the accounts of those who dealt with it, characteristically methodical and characteristically slow. Policies were scrutinized. Claims were contested. The definition of what constituted a covered loss versus an act of God beyond the scope of the policy was debated in the particular fine-grained way that insurance companies debate these things when large amounts of money are involved. Some claimants were paid promptly and in full, others were paid eventually after negotiation, others were paid less than they had expected, for reasons that the policy language examined closely technically supported. The blizzard was, in this respect as in others, a very efficient revealer of the gap between what people believed their arrangements provided and what those arrangements, in practice, actually delivered. A disaster on the scale of the blizzard of 1888 creates, almost as a natural byproduct, a substantial amount of blame, and 1888 was no different. The Weather Service took criticism for its inadequate forecast, which was fair. The railroads took criticism for their failure to clear their lines quickly enough, which was also fair if somewhat unrealistic given the scale of the problem. The city government of New York took criticism for the state of the streets, for the pace of the cleanup, for the cost being passed to ratepayers, and for various other failures both real and imagined. Because criticizing the city government of New York for something is a tradition that predates the city government itself. What was perhaps most interesting politically was what the blizzard made visible. The enormous gap between how the wealthy experienced the storm in warm townhouses with servants to manage the coal and food delivered at whatever the going rate happened to be, and how everyone else experienced it, which was outside in it trying to get somewhere they could not get to. The political blame that attached to the weather service was, in some ways, the most straightforward of all the accusations flying around in the days after the storm. The forecast had been wrong. The forecast had been wrong in a way that had cost lives. The connection between those two facts was not complicated, and the newspapers drew it clearly and repeatedly. What the newspapers were somewhat less interested in examining was the structural reason the forecast had been wrong. The understaffing, the limited data, the fundamental impossibility of accurately predicting a storm forming over the open ocean with the instruments available in 1888. Blaming a sergeant in the Signal Corps for not having satellite imagery was not, technically speaking, fair. But fairness has never been the primary criterion by which disaster blame is assigned, and the Signal Corps took its share regardless. The railroads were a more politically complicated target because the railroads in 1888 were not merely transportation companies, they were among the most powerful political forces in the country, with relationships in Congress and in state legislatures that they had spent decades and considerable money cultivating. Criticizing the railroads publicly was something that newspapers did with enthusiasm and that politicians did with considerably more caution. The railroad executives who appeared before various inquiries in the weeks after the storm were polished and well prepared, and very good at explaining in technical detail why everything that had happened had been the result of circumstances beyond anyone's control rather than decisions anyone had made. Some of the inquiries found this explanation satisfying. Some did not. None of them resulted in anything that materially changed how the railroads operated in bad weather. The city government of New York, presided over at the time by Mayor Abram Hewitt, took criticism from every direction simultaneously, which is the standard condition of New York mayors during any crisis, and which Mayor Hewitt handled with the particular resigned competence of a man who had expected this and was not enjoying being right. The cleanup was too slow. The contracts for snow removal were too expensive. The money was being wasted. The neighborhoods that had been cleared first were the wrong ones. Too wealthy. Too connected, too well represented in the halls of city government. The neighborhoods that had waited longest for attention were, predictably, the ones whose residents had the least political leverage and the most to lose from the delay. This pattern was not new in 1888. It was not new in any city in any era. The blizzard simply made it more visible, more measurable, and harder to look away from for the duration of the conversation, which lasted until the next thing happened and the conversation moved on. The single most lasting structural consequence of the blizzard of 1888 was something that took years to build and change the city for over a century after: the subway. Before the blizzard, New York's primary rapid transit was its elevated railways, the trains running on tracks above the street level that had stalled so catastrophically in the storm, stranding passengers 20 feet above the buried sidewalks with nowhere to go. After the blizzard, the conversation about putting those lines underground gained an urgency it had previously lacked. If the elevated railways were vulnerable to the weather, then perhaps the answer was to put the railways somewhere the weather could not reach. New York opened its first subway line in 1904, 16 years after the blizzard. The connection between the two is not always drawn in the history books, but it is there. The storm that buried the city above ground made the case for a city that could move underground, and the millions of people who have ridden the subway in every direction since then are, in a roundabout way, the beneficiaries of the worst winter America had ever seen. The idea of an underground railway in New York was not new in 1888. A pneumatic subway had actually been built and briefly operated in secret beneath Broadway in 1870 by an inventor named Alfred Ely Beach, who'd constructed it without proper authorization and who had kept it hidden from the city's notoriously corrupt political machine for as long as he could manage. The Beach pneumatic subway operated for a few years, attracted considerable public interest, and then was shut down when the political winds shifted against it. By 1888, the tunnel Beach had built was still there, sealed and forgotten beneath Broadway, while the elevated railways above it were doing their best and failing in the blizzard. The proximity of those two facts, the forgotten underground solution directly beneath the failing above-ground system, was not lost on everyone paying attention. The post-blizzard conversation about underground transit was part of a broader reckoning with the infrastructure of the city that the storm had forced. The telegraph wires that had come down needed to go underground. The transit that had stalled in the weather needed to go underground. The general lesson that the blizzard had offered, that systems built in the open air were vulnerable to the open air, pointed in a consistent direction, and the direction was down. This was not a cheap solution. Tunnelling under a built-up city is expensive in any era, and was particularly expensive in the 1880s and 90s, when the technology for doing it was still being developed, and the financial arrangements for funding it were still being argued about. The arguments went on for years, the financing was complicated, the politics were, as always in New York, enthusiastically messy. The subway that finally opened in 1904 was the product of all of that argument and complication and expense, and it was also, immediately, a transformation. The city that had been held hostage by its weather in March of 1888 now had a way to move underground regardless of what was happening above. The blizzard did not build the subway, but it made the case for it with a clarity that no amount of advocacy or urban planning theory could have matched. It showed the city, in the most visceral possible terms, what happened when the system you depended on was exposed to the sky. And the city eventually drew the logical conclusion and went underground. Every morning rush hour in every direction, the argument that the blizzard of 1888 made continues to be proven correct, one train at a time. The survivors of the blizzard of 1888 talked about it for the rest of their lives, which is perhaps the clearest possible signal that it was as bad as the historical record suggests. It became the measuring stick for all subsequent bad weather in the American Northeast, the baseline from which every future snowstorm was assessed, usually unfavourably. Not as bad as 88. Nothing like 88. If you think this is a blizzard, you didn't live through 88. People who were children during the storm grew into adults who were still talking about it in the 1930s and 40s, which means the blizzard of 1888 outlasted the people who were already middle-aged when it hit. In 1888, a group of survivors actually formed an organisation, the Blizzard Men of 1888, that held annual dinners for decades. They ate, they told stories, they compared their experiences, and they did what survivors of shared catastrophe have always done. They turned the worst days they'd ever lived through into the best stories they'd ever tell. The annual dinners of the Blizzard Men were held in New York for decades after the storm, and they are a fascinating document of how collective memory works when a group of people decide to take it seriously. At each dinner, members told their stories, where they had been when the storm hit, what they had done, who had helped them, what they had seen. The stories changed over the years, as stories do, acquiring details and losing others, becoming slightly more dramatic in the retelling, which is not dishonesty, but simply the natural process by which human memory shapes itself into something that can be told at a dinner table. The core of each story, the specific physical experience of being caught in something enormous and surviving it, remained consistent even as the edges softened and brightened with the passage of time. The particular quality of blizzard memory is that it is sensory in a way that most memories are not. People who experienced the blizzard of 1888 did not remember it primarily as a sequence of events. They remembered it as a physical experience. The specific weight of the wind, the temperature of the air against their faces, the sound of the snow moving, the feeling of their feet in drifts that were deeper than anything they had reference for. These sensory memories are remarkably durable. People who have trouble recalling the details of most events from their lives can often recall the specific physical quality of a major disaster with extraordinary clarity decades later. The blizzard survivors who were interviewed in their 70s and 80s could still describe what the air had smelled like that morning. They could still describe the exact moment when they had understood that this was something different from any storm they had known before. What the stories also preserved in their accumulation was the social texture of the event, the specific people who had helped, the strangers who'd been kind, the moments of improvised community in saloons and schoolrooms and stalled railway cars. The blizzard of 1888 did not produce uniform heroism. It produced human behaviour in the full range of what that means, from the generous to the opportunistic. But the stories that survived in the telling, the ones that the blizzard men returned to year after year, were overwhelmingly the stories of people helping each other. This is not because the price gouging and the selfishness did not happen. They did, and they were documented. It is because humans, in the long run, tend to tell the stories that reflect what they wish had been true, which sometimes, gloriously, turns out to be what actually was. Not everyone was caught outside when the blizzard of 1888 hit, and for the people who happened to already be home, who had been sick, or had a day off, or had simply decided on Sunday evening not to go anywhere on Monday, the experience of the storm was entirely different in character, if not in intensity. For them, the blizzard was something that happened outside the window, which is a completely different thing than something that is happening to your face. They woke up Monday morning to a world that had changed while they slept, and then they were stuck in it, not in the dangerous way, but in the profound, slightly disorienting way of people who cannot leave and must simply wait. They watched the snow pile up against the glass. They kept the stove fed. They ate what was in the house. They read, or they talked, or they sat in the specific kind of companionable silence that forms between people who are trapped together in warmth, while something enormous happens beyond their control. For some of them, it was the most rest they had gotten in years. The people who were already home when the storm hit inhabited a completely different version of the blizzard from the one being lived by the commuters on the elevated railways or the delivery men in the streets. Their version was quieter, slower, and had the particular quality of enforced suspension that major storms have always provided. The quality of being released temporarily from all obligations, because the obligations cannot reach you through the snow. In 1888, with no telephone and no telegraph, and no way for an employer or a creditor or an obligation of any kind to communicate across the buried streets, the people who were home were genuinely completely unreachable. This was, for many of them, a novel experience, and not an entirely unpleasant one. The domestic arrangements inside those houses and apartments took on a particular intensity during the storm. People who normally scattered to their various obligations in the morning were suddenly together all day, which was either wonderful or terrible depending on the household, and in many cases both at different moments. Children who were always being sent somewhere were suddenly nowhere to send. Adults who were normally at work were suddenly at home with nothing specific to do except keep the fire going and manage the provisions and talk to each other, which is either a gift or a burden depending on how much you have to say and whether you have said most of it already. The provisioning of the house became, during the storm, a matter of genuine strategic interest. People inventoried what they had: the coal in the scuttle, the food in the pantry, the water in the cistern, and made calculations about how long it would last against an unknown duration of confinement. These calculations were conducted with varying degrees of accuracy and varying degrees of anxiety. The households that had well-stocked pantries and full coal bins were comfortable in a way that felt, by the second day of the storm, almost guilty given what was happening outside. The households that had been planning to shop on Monday found themselves reckoning with what they had on hand, and how far it could be stretched, which is a reckoning that concentrates the mind considerably. The blizzard was, for the people inside watching it, a window, quite literally, into a version of the world that did not normally present itself so clearly. A world where everything that normally moved had stopped, and what remained was just the warmth you had managed to keep, and the people you were keeping it with. The Great Blizzard of 1888 was not just a weather event. It was a revelation, a moment when the most modern, most connected, most technologically confident city in America discovered that it was still, under everything, extremely fragile. The elevated railways failed, the telegraph failed, the roads failed, the supply chains failed, the weather forecast failed. Everything that the late 19th century had spent decades building, all the infrastructure and the systems and the quiet daily confidence that civilization was a permanent condition rather than a temporary arrangement, all of it was suspended for 48 hours by snow, and what remained when the systems failed was people, strangers sharing heat, neighbours with coal helping neighbours without, saloon keepers opening their doors, teachers staying with their students, individuals making small, unremarkable decisions to help the person nearest to them. The storm killed over 400 people, and it saved the lives of thousands more through exactly this mechanism. It did not have a neat moral, but it had something better. Proof, in the coldest possible terms, that infrastructure is borrowed and community is built. The changes that the blizzard drove are traceable through the decades that followed it, with a particular clarity of changes that had a specific, datable cause. The subway opened in 1904. The telegraph wires went underground. The Weather Bureau was established as a civilian agency with better funding, better staffing, and a mandate to improve the science of forecasting. Emergency planning, the idea that a city should think in advance about what it would do when its normal systems failed, became a more serious subject in the offices of city governments across the northeast. None of these changes happened because of the blizzard alone. All of them happened faster, with more urgency and more public support, because the blizzard had made the need for them impossible to ignore. The deeper change was harder to see and slower to measure, but it was real. The blizzard of 1888 permanently altered the relationship that Americans had with winter weather, not by making them less afraid of it, but by making them more honest about what it could do. The comfortable assumption that modern infrastructure had tamed the natural world, that the systems built in the second half of the 19th century were robust enough to handle whatever the weather produced, did not survive the blizzard intact. What replaced it was something more cautious and more realistic, an understanding that the systems were good and getting better, and still fundamentally at the mercy of conditions they could not fully anticipate or control. This is not a comforting understanding. It is an accurate one. An accuracy, even uncomfortable accuracy, tends to produce better decisions than comfortable illusion. The blizzard also left behind a story, the kind of story that a city tells about itself, and that shapes, in small ways, how it understands itself afterward. New York's story about the blizzard of 1888 is a story about surviving something enormous, about the systems failing and the people not failing, about strangers pulling each other out of snowbanks and saloon keepers opening their doors and teachers staying with their students through the night. It is a story with real heroism in it, and real tragedy in it, and real human messiness in it, and it has been told and retold for over 100 years because it contains something true, not just about New York and not just about 1888, but about what happens when the thing you built to protect you stops working, and you have to figure out, with the people around you, how to get through anyway. The blizzard is over. The snow melted a long time ago, but the story it told about what cities are made of, underneath the infrastructure and the systems and the confident machinery of modern life, is still being told. And it is still, in its cold and uncomfortable way, correct. You're wealthy in New York City in March of 1888, and the blizzard, while inconvenient, is not going to kill you. This is the part of the story that doesn't always make it into the dramatic retellings, but it is true, and it is important, and it is, frankly, as relevant now as it was then. The city's upper classes experienced the blizzard of 1888 from behind glass, from the tall windows of their brownstones on Fifth Avenue, and the parlours of their townhouses on Murray Hill, watching the same storm that was burying their delivery drivers and freezing their coal men with the detached interest of people for whom weather has always been, ultimately, someone else's problem. They had coal stockpiled, they had pantries full, they had servants who'd been up since before dawn, keeping the fires going and the hallways warm. Servants who had, in many cases, gotten to work by walking through the very storm their employers were now observing from comfortable chairs with cups of tea. The blizzard did not spare the wealthy from inconvenience. Dinner parties were cancelled, planned journeys were abandoned, the opera was inaccessible, but inconvenience, as a category of suffering, sits at a considerable remove from genuine danger, and the blizzard of 1888 made that distance visible in a way that even the most carefully maintained class boundaries could not entirely obscure. The houses of the wealthy in 1888 were built to be warm, which is a sentence that sounds obvious until you consider that the houses of the poor in 1888 were very much not. The brownstones and townhouses of the upper and upper middle classes had proper insulation, double-hung windows that actually sealed, coal furnaces in their basements producing heat that rose through the house in a way that made the whole building comfortable rather than just the room with the fire in it. They had coal cellars filled at the beginning of winter with enough fuel to last until spring without rationing. They had pantries stocked with preserved and imported food that did not depend on Monday's delivery to be present on Tuesday's table. They had, in short, the infrastructure of comfort that turns a dangerous situation into a merely inconvenient one, and they had it specifically because they could afford it. The servants who kept those houses running during the blizzard occupy an interesting position in the history of the event. They were working people, with the working person's experience of the storm, exposed to it, physically labouring through it, denied the option of simply sitting still until it passed. But they were working people inside warm buildings, which put them in a category between the comfortable wealthy and the genuinely endangered poor. They shovel the stoops, they manage the coal, they cook the meals and kept the fires, and maintained the routines of households whose members had the luxury of treating the storm as a disruption rather than a crisis. They did not, in most cases, record their experiences of the blizzard. Their employers' diaries and letters survive. The servants' accounts mostly do not. This is a pattern in historical documentation that is very old, and that the blizzard of 1888 did not invent and did not fix. What the blizzard did, with unusual clarity, was place the two experiences side by side in a way that was difficult to ignore even for people who are accustomed to ignoring it. The wealthy New Yorker looking out his window at the buried street was looking at the same storm that was killing people 50 blocks downtown. The snow fell on Fifth Avenue and it fell on Mulberry Street, and it accumulated at the same rate in both places. What differed was everything that the snow fell onto: the quality of the housing, the adequacy of the heat, the sufficiency of the food, the availability of help. The blizzard did not create those differences, it simply illuminated them, with the cold, impartial light of a catastrophe that does not care about your address but is very much affected by what your address provides. Here is a thing that does not seem like it should be possible and yet was. During the blizzard of 1888, buildings caught fire, and the fire department could not reach them. In a city buried under several feet of snow, with streets impassable and drifts stacked higher than the fire wagons themselves, the gap between a fire breaking out and the fire brigade arriving stretched from minutes into hours, and in a burning building, hours are not something you have. The fires that broke out during the blizzard were started the same way most fires were started in 1888. Overloaded stoves, chimneys that hadn't been cleaned and were now being pushed harder than usual by people trying to stay warm. Candles knocked over in dark rooms by people navigating without adequate light. The city's firefighters, who are among the most capable in the world at what they did under ordinary circumstances, found themselves dragging equipment through snowdrifts on foot, because the horses couldn't move and the wagons couldn't roll, and the fires did not wait. Some buildings burned to their foundations while help was still trying to get there, and the snow that fell on the ruins afterward covered them cleanly, as if the storm was tidying up after itself. The particular cruelty of fire during a blizzard is that it combines the two most hostile environments a building can face simultaneously, and makes them work against each other in the worst possible way. The snow that should, in theory, help suppress a fire was in practice suppressing the firefighters instead. The drifts that blocked the fire wagons were the same drifts that trapped the people who needed rescuing. The cold that made the fire more dangerous by driving people to overload their stoves was the same cold that was making the streets impassable for the people trying to respond to what the overloaded stoves had started. It was a system of compounding disadvantages, each one making the next one worse, with the fire sitting at the centre of it all, doing what fire does when no one can get to it in time. The New York Fire Department of 1888 was a genuinely impressive institution, well trained, well equipped by the standards of the era, and staffed by men who understood their work as genuinely dangerous, and who did it anyway with a professionalism that the city depended on. What the department was not equipped for was operating without horses. The fire wagons of the period were heavy, horse-drawn pieces of equipment, the steam-powered pumpers, the ladder wagons, the hose reels, none of which could be moved through drifts 5 feet deep by human strength alone. Some companies tried. Firefighters who could not move their equipment intact dragged what they could by hand. Hoses, hand tools, whatever could be disconnected from the wagon and carried. They arrived at fires already exhausted from the journey through the snow, with partial equipment, and then did their best, which under the circumstances was frequently not enough. The buildings that burned during the blizzard were disproportionately the cheapest and most densely occupied ones in the city. The wooden tenements of the Lower East Side, packed with families who were burning coal as fast as they could afford it to stay warm, were the most vulnerable to fire under ordinary circumstances and remained the most vulnerable during the blizzard. The combination of overcrowding, inadequate construction, overworked heating equipment, and now an inaccessible fire department was, for the residents of those buildings, a genuine terror. The knowledge that if the building caught fire, you were on your own, and the distance between on your own and catastrophic outcome was, in a burning tenement on a buried street in a blizzard, not very large at all. The fires that the department reached in time were saved. The fires it could not reach in time are part of the storm's death toll, counted in the final numbers without always being specifically identified as fire deaths rather than blizzard deaths, which is accurate enough. In March of 1888, the distinction was not always meaningful. Coney Island in March of 1888 was not the Coney Island of the postcards and the summer crowds and the hot dogs and the carousel music. It was a windswept peninsula at the southern tip of Brooklyn, largely deserted of its seasonal visitors, home to a skeleton crew of year-round residents and the kind of establishments that operated in the off-season because they had nowhere else to be. When the blizzard hit, Coney Island took it from the ocean side, which meant it took it at full strength, with no buildings or topography to soften anything. The wind came off the Atlantic with the unchecked confidence of something that had been building speed for 1,000 miles of open water and was not interested in courtesy. The drifts that formed on the island were extraordinary. Some accounts describe them as reaching the roof lines of the smaller buildings, which would put them at 12 to 15 feet in places. The handful of residents who were there rode it out in whatever structures were available and hoped the structures agreed to stay standing, which, given what the wind was doing, was not a certainty anyone was comfortable making. Coney Island in the summer of 1888 was one of the most popular destinations on the American East Coast, a place where New Yorkers of every class and background came to escape the heat of the city, to eat and drink and promenade and ride the mechanical attractions that were beginning to turn the island into something approaching an amusement park. Hotels and bathhouses and beer halls lined the beachfront. The whole enterprise ran on the logic of summer abundance and warm weather and the specific energy of a crowd determined to enjoy itself. In March, that logic had been suspended. The hotels were either closed or minimally staffed. The bathhouses were shuttered. The beer halls that stayed open through the winter did so in the quiet, resigned way of establishments, whose regular customers had gone somewhere warmer and who were simply waiting for them to come back. The year-round residents of Coney Island were a particular kind of community, people who had chosen, for various reasons, to live in a place that was genuinely pleasant for 4 months of the year and genuinely difficult for the other 8. They were fishermen and hotel workers and small business owners and the kind of people who like living at the edge of things, where the city ends and the ocean begins. They were accustomed to winter storms off the Atlantic. What they were not accustomed to was the blizzard of 1888, which arrived with a force and duration that exceeded anything in living memory, and which imposed itself on the island's flat, exposed geography with a completeness that was almost total. The ocean during the blizzard was extraordinary in the reports of those who could see it, which was not many people and not for long. The waves driven by 80-mile-per-hour winds over open water were enormous. estimates in the accounts that survive put them at heights that would have been remarkable in any season, and that in a blizzard, with spray freezing as it left the water and the visibility dropping to nothing within 100 yards of shore, created a seascape that was simultaneously spectacular and completely terrifying. The boardwalk structures that lined the beach, the newer, lighter construction of the amusement era that had been built for summer loads and summer weather, took the storm very badly. Sections of boardwalk were torn away. Smaller buildings that had not been properly secured lost their roofs or their walls, or in some cases the distinction between the two. The island that emerged from the blizzard on Wednesday was physically altered from the island that had gone into it on Monday, and the work of repairing it before the summer season was one more item added to the enormous regional invoice that the storm was generating. In 1888, the United States mail was not merely a convenience. It was the primary means by which the country communicated with itself over any distance. Business correspondence, personal letters, financial instruments, legal documents, newspapers sent to subscribers in other cities, all of it moved through the postal system, which moved through the railroads, which were, as of Monday morning, March 12th, 1888, not moving at all. The blizzard effectively silenced postal communication across the entire Northeast for days, and the backlog it created took weeks to fully clear. Letters that had been mailed before the storm sat in sorting facilities that couldn't be reached. Mail that was already in transit sat in railway cars that were buried on sidings. Businesses that were waiting on correspondence to finalise transactions, individuals waiting on news from family members, newspapers waiting on their out-of-town editions, all of them waited in the particular, grinding frustration of people who are accustomed to a system working and have suddenly been reminded that systems are not laws of nature. They are arrangements. And arrangements can be buried under 20 feet of snow just like everything else. The postal system of 1888 was a remarkable achievement of organisation, a network that moved mail reliably across a continent of nearly 60 million people, using a combination of railroads, horse-drawn delivery wagons, and an army of clerks and carriers whose job was to ensure that what was sent arrived where it was addressed to. The system worked because its components worked, and the components worked because the railroads ran on schedule and the roads were passable and the carriers could complete their routes. Remove those assumptions and you had not a postal system but a postal backlog, which is what the blizzard of 1888 immediately created and which no amount of organisational efficiency could resolve until the snow was out of the way. The sorting facilities where mail was held during the disruption filled up quickly. Mail poured in from the parts of the network that were still functioning and had nowhere to go because the parts ahead of it in the chain were not moving. Postal workers who made it to the facilities found themselves managing an accumulation they could sort but could not dispatch, which is the postal equivalent of being very busy doing nothing useful. The mail was organised and categorised and stacked with professional precision, and it sat perfectly sorted going nowhere, while the snow outside continued to make the going nowhere entirely official. The personal cost of the mail stoppage was felt most acutely by people who were waiting for specific pieces of correspondence. In an era without telephones, a letter was often the only way to know that someone distant from you was all right. The families of the men who had been caught out in the storm and had not come home, or who had taken shelter somewhere and had no way to send word, had no means of knowing, during the days the mail was stopped, whether their silence meant safety or catastrophe. This uncertainty, which the modern mind might try to resolve with a quick phone call or a text message, had no resolution available to it in 1888, except waiting. Waiting for the mail to move, waiting for the snow to clear, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs that would mean someone had made it home. The mail started moving again after a few days, slowly at first, then with increasing normalcy as the railroad lines were cleared. But the weeks it took to work through the backlog meant that some of those letters arrived so late that the news they carried had already been superseded by events. The worry they had been written to address already resolved one way or another before the envelope was ever opened. When the snow finally began to melt, slowly, then faster, in the particular way that northeast springs have always worked, as if the weather is apologizing in increments, it revealed things. This is the part of the blizzard story that does not appear in many accounts, because it is not dramatic in the conventional sense, but it is in its own way the most sobering chapter of the whole event. The melt revealed bodies, people who had been lost in the storm and not found, whose locations had been unknown since the drifts took them, and who emerged now as the city thawed, sometimes close to where they had last been seen, sometimes surprisingly far. It revealed the full extent of the damage to infrastructure, the twisted telegraph poles, the warped rail lines, the collapsed roofs of buildings that had not been designed to bear the weight of what had been loaded onto them. It revealed, in the grim arithmetic of livestock and property, exactly how much had been lost, and it revealed something else too, something quieter and harder to quantify. The spring that followed the blizzard of 1888 had a particular quality to it, a brightness that people who had lived through the storm noticed and remarked upon, as if the city, having survived something that had genuinely tried to end it, found the subsequent warmth more remarkable than warmth had ever seemed before. The process of the thaw was not instantaneous, and in some of the more sheltered and densely drifted parts of the city, it was not even fast. The deep drifts that had formed in the narrow streets of lower Manhattan, where the buildings on either side had channeled the wind and concentrated the snow, were shaded from the strengthening March sun by those same buildings and melted last. Piles of cleared snow that had been shoveled into corners and against walls during the clean-up persisted into April, grey, compressed, ice-laden remnants of what had been, 2 weeks earlier, the substance of a catastrophe. Children climbed them, dogs investigated them, adults walked around them with the particular irritation of people who are ready for winter to be over and are being denied the satisfaction of a clean ending. What the melt did to the streets was a second disaster of a lower order. The snow melt that ran off the enormous accumulated deposits overwhelmed the city's drainage systems such as they were, and produced flooding in the lower-lying neighbourhoods and basement apartments that had already been through enough. The water that had fallen as snow and stayed frozen for days now became liquid all at once, and the sewers that were designed for ordinary runoff were not designed for the sudden liquefaction of weeks' worth of accumulated blizzard. Basements flooded, streets pooled. The ice that had been a danger as a solid became, as a liquid, a different kind of problem for the people who lived at ground level and below it, who were, as always, the people least able to address it and most affected by it. The bodies recovered during the thaw were among the most sombre findings of the whole event. They were found in drifts, in alleys, in corners where the wind had deposited them after they had stopped being able to move on their own. They were found close to doors they had almost reached and far from anywhere recognizable. They were found by the people who were doing the shoveling, which meant that the workers hired to clear the city's streets were also, without any specific preparation for it, doing the work of finding its dead. The final accounting of the storm's human cost was assembled from these discoveries over weeks, added to the deaths that had been documented during the storm itself, until the number settled at over 400 and stayed there. Spring came fully in April, as it always does, with the particular insistence of a season that does not ask permission. The trees in the parks put out their leaves, the vendors returned to the streets, the noise of the city, which the blizzard had silenced so completely for those 40 hours, came back in full measure, and the people who had been through it, who'd been cold and frightened and stuck and in some cases nearly lost, felt the warmth on their faces and understood it, that March, in a way they had not quite understood it before. And so, tonight, you have travelled back to March of 1888. You have stood on the street corner when the wind changed direction and the snow started moving sideways. You have been on the platform when the train stopped and did not start again. You have been in the saloon with the strangers by the stove, waiting for something that was taking longer than anyone had expected. You have been in the farmhouse, holding the rope, feeling your way through the white. You have been the teacher who stayed, the neighbour who shovelled, the person who opened the door. And you have seen what happens when all of it, the railways and the telegraph and the forecasts and the supply chains and the quiet, confident machinery of a modern civilization, stops working at once. What you found underneath, when all of it stopped, was not chaos. Not entirely. What you found was people. Ordinary, tired, cold, frightened, sometimes selfish, mostly generous, always stubborn people, making the smallest possible decisions in the direction of survival and kindness. One shovelful and one shared coal scuttle, and one open door at a time. The 400 who did not make it through deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as people who left home on an ordinary Monday morning with ordinary plans, and were taken by something that did not give them a fair chance. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were people who made reasonable decisions in unreasonable conditions, and the storm did not care about the distinction. We carry their names poorly, most of them, because history has always been better at recording what was built than who was lost. But they were there, and the city they lived in was changed by losing them. The blizzard built the subway, it buried the wires, it made the weather service more honest, and the city planners more humble, and the engineers more careful about what they put above ground and what they chose to protect beneath it. It made a generation of New Yorkers permanently suspicious of a mild forecast and permanently grateful for a warm room. It produced, in the spring that followed it, the particular brightness that survivors of hard winters know, the brightness that comes not from the sun being stronger, but from you being more awake to it. So tonight, as you sink into your warm bed with your heated house, and your weather app and your central everything, maybe take just a moment. Not to feel guilty. Guilt is not the right response to comfort. Just to feel it. The warmth of the blanket. The stillness of the air. The fact that outside, whatever the weather is doing, you do not have to be in it. Your ancestors stood on open platforms in 80-mile-per-hour wind and held onto ropes in whiteouts and dragged coal through 5-foot drifts and sat in stalled railway cars waiting for a help that was doing its best to reach them. They were cold in ways that took days to stop being cold. They were frightened in ways that the spring did not entirely resolve. And they made it. Most of them made it. And because they made it, and because they built things differently afterward, and because they remembered and told the stories and passed them down, you are here, warm, listening to this on the other side of all of it. The snow of 1888 is long gone. The city it buried has been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt again. But somewhere in the bones of New York, in the tunnels running underground, in the wires running beneath the streets, in the architecture of a city that learned the hard way to put its most important things where the weather could not reach them. The blizzard is still present, still shaping the place it once tried to destroy. Sleep well tonight. You've earned it. They earned it first.